My name is Matthew Gabriele. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Religion and Culture here at Tech. The book that I'm going to talk a little bit about is this new one, this is the library copy. I was fortunate my book came out in both paper and hardback at the same time, which is not common in presses, which was very nice. And this is the ugly library copy, because I don't have any more of the nice paperback ones. It's called Apocalypse and Reform, From Late Antiquity to the Middle Ages, and it's a co-edited book with a colleague at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And so what I thought I would do today is to talk about two things, is to talk just briefly about kind of the process of the book coming to fruition, because it's a co-edited one as opposed to much more interesting monographs, which we'll hear about in a little bit. And then I'll talk about kind of my contributions within that, within the book. So the process itself was actually deeply serendipitous, as again, this is a collaboration with a colleague at St. Andrews. I happened to be at a medieval studies conference when a mutual friend looked at me, and I will always remember this, said, "Hey Matt, you do that weird apocalyptic stuff, right?" And I said, "Yeah, I do that weird apocalyptic stuff." And I said, "Oh, I want you to meet this guy. I just read the paper, it was really interesting." And so I was introduced to James. So we had kind of generative conversation about what apocalypticism is, and I'll talk kind of why that's kind of important within the context of the book in a minute. And we decided that we would kind of stay in touch. And so after that, our conversations we were talking about, so we were both working on monographs at the same time, our original first books, and during that process we thought like, hey, there's a little bit more to say even beyond kind of the monographs, and so we decided to put together a series of panels at one of the largest medieval studies conferences in Leeds, at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. Those went together. While we were there, the people seemed really interested. The panelists who we got together seemed very interested in pursuing this and in expanding the conference papers into something more substantive. And so we just went to the bookstalls and talked to a bunch of different presses. And for graduate students, if you're unfamiliar, this is oftentimes how books get made, is you go up to a publisher who happens to be at a conference and say, hey, do you want to publish a book? We have an idea. Some of them, they were very interested. Routledge was extremely interested. They offered us a contract. We put it together. And there it is. And this is actually even expanded, though I don't want to jinx it. It seems like this will ultimately become a new book series on global apocalypticisms with coming out with Routledge, hopefully starting, knock on wood, next year. Okay. So that's the process of the book itself, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the future. As far as my contributions itself, is that if you look through the table of contents, we have a wide variety of presenters. There are, I think, 11 contributors from universities ranging across Europe, from Australia, from the United States as well. Even a number of contributors whose English is not their native language, which presented its own problems, but like that. But the interesting thing was that we're talking about this phenomenon that we call apocalypticism, and then this other phenomenon that we call reform, which is another key title in the word in the title. And these are often, at least in medieval studies, and certainly in I think in the discipline of histories, they're juxtaposed. It seems to be a paradox to put them together. Apocalypse seems to look forward. It's towards the end. It's an unknowable future, or within kind of a theological concept of perhaps a very knowable future, depending on what you think about Revelation. And then reform seems to be about a return. It's about looking backwards towards the past. So they seem to be kind of diametrically opposed. What James and I ultimately decided, and our contributors kind of think about, is if you situate these instead of as kind of abstract, very old school kind of intellectual history ideas, but much more framed within their own cultural context, in our case, late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, is that you see them oftentimes said in the same breath. And specifically is that they seem to be kind of two sides of the same coin, in which you have to go backwards in order to go forwards. So you need reform in order to advance the timeline of sacred history, in order to arrive at something that seems to be preordained. So for example, in our introduction, we talk about, I give this, that was co-written by myself and Dr. Palmer, is I give this example of a bloody rain. In 1027 in the area of Aquitaine in southwestern France, supposedly there was this bloody rain, this reddish rain that fell across the entire province. the people of the time, including King Robert II, King Robert the Pious at the time, had no idea what was going on. He wrote to a number of churchmen asking them for explanations. And by and large, we have both the letter that he wrote, which survives in the original manuscript, but also in a couple of the responses that were offered to him. And the responses, by and large, kind of imply reform, is that this is a sign from God that things have gotten, kind of, the kingdom has gone off the rails and it requires reform, right? But in one of those letters, especially by a bishop by the name of Fulbert of Chartres, who's a very prominent churchman in the early 11th century, he makes reference at one point to, what does it say, the most unnoble and most secret time, right? Which, that this is happening in a most unnoble and most secret time. Okay, that's fine. But the Latin that's used there specifically is an almost direct quotation from Matthew 24:3, which is the little apocalypse that's in Matthew, right? In which Jesus is exhorting his apostles that they know not the time or the hour, that the end is coming, basically. Now, we have to remember, right, that Robert and the churchmen, and certainly Bishop Fulbert of Chartres, would have known exactly what he was doing, right? That's not a cloaked reference. It might be unknowable, it might be unseen to us, but it's particularly important within that context. And so, the reform that he's calling for is ultimately tethered always and already with looking towards the future and towards the end. So the timeline, in a sense, kind of collapses in this moment, in which the thing that is happening is the same as or is tied to the thing that has happened and the thing that will happen in the future. Okay. So, and that kind of connects all the essays that are presented in the volume, and that those range from everything from the 3rd and 4th century all the way up to the late 12th, and there's even some stuff in the afterward by the very smart Gabriele at the University of Tennessee to country music songs. So, pick it up for Christmas. All right, so anyway, it's in paperback, so it's cheaper. So anyway, all right, so and then in my own contribution within this essay, and I don't even remember the title exactly, so I'm going to look it up. Which is called This Time, Maybe This Time, Biblical Commentary, Monastic Historiography, and Lost Causism at the Turn of the First Millennium. I kind of try to play with this idea about the collapse of time by using a William Faulkner quotation. And I'm just going to read it if it's okay. So, indulge me, okay? Faulkner writes, and this is from Intruder in the Dusk, for every Southern boy 14 years old, there's the instant when it's still not yet 2 o'clock in the July afternoon in 1863. The brigades are in position behind the rail fence, the guns are laid and ready in the woods, and the furled flags are already loosened to break out. And Pickett himself, with his long oiled ringlets and his hat in one hand probably and his sword in the other, looking up the hill, waiting for Longstreet to give the word, and it's all in the balance. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't even begun yet. It's not only hasn't begun yet, but there is still time for it not to begin. And that moment doesn't need even a 14-year-old boy to think this time, maybe this time. Now this is often held up, I mean, they're talking about the Pickett's charge right before the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. And what this is often held up is kind of this monument, or this kind of encapsulation of lost cause nostalgia for the Confederacy, right? In which this 14-year-old Southern boy, in Faulkner's estimation, is looking back at Pickett's charge, oftentimes said as kind of the moment that the Confederacy lost the Civil War, and he's hoping that it can happen again, but it'll happen differently. Right? Not that it'll stop, not that history can change. Well, not that history can kind of stop, but that it can change. That we can go back to the past and alternate and chart a new way forward. Okay? And so in the texts that I'm looking at in this particular essay, which are primarily 11th century monastic texts, histories about both about Aquitaine, about northern France, about Italy, northern Italy, and places like that, is you see the same kind of conceptualization, in which they think about, they're writing about the past in order not necessarily to understand it in kind of a modern kind of antiquarian sense, but in order to think about how that impacts the present, and in fact, as a model for how we can chart a new way forward, that we can recreate the past in a very particular way so that we can advance sacred time in a meaningful way that will get us into a kind of a better place. In some cases, that means we can defeat the Muslim invaders, we can persecute the Jews, we can reform the church in these very understandable ways, right? And it's framed as reform, but ultimately, I'm trying to argue that it's the same as apocalypse. Okay. And so, again, there's much more to say there, but I'll kind of bring it to a close by saying that it was much about this essay, which again I wrote a while ago, publication publication process obviously takes a long time, which I'm turning into a monograph that I'm finishing up right now for Oxford, in which I'll explore these kind of ideas further and talk about kind of how exegesis, biblical commentary, begins to suffuse historiography in the 11th century, how it clouds our understanding of time or obfuscates our understanding of time, but in fact clarifies the way that they're thinking about the way that the present actually functions in their own Middle Ages. So, thank you very much.
Great.